Section 5 of the Outline of Science, Volume 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Stephanie Lee. The Outline of Science by J. Arthur Thomson. Section 5. Natural History 4. Botany, Part 1. Wonders of Plant Life. The genealogical tree of living creatures may be thought of as like a letter V. On the one side are animals, on the other side are plants. At the base there are simple forms of life which have not taken any decisive step in either direction. It is easy to distinguish a buttercup from a butterfly, but it is not so clear at first sight how a mushroom differs from a sponge. And at the base of the genealogical tree there are protists, which are sometimes claimed by the botanist and sometimes by the zoologist. Some of these very simple organisms give us a glimpse of what the first living creatures may have been like. Dependence of animals on plants. The image of the letter V is useful, because it suggests that plants and animals, though both alive, are on very different tacks of evolution. But we could improve on the symbol if we showed a tracery of fine twigs, binding the two sides together. For plants and animals have grown up together through the ages, and are linked together in mutual influence and dependence. This is the subject of a separate article on interrelations. There are three great ways in which the animal world as a whole is dependent on plants. First, there is nutritive dependence, for it is wholly through the agency of green plants that animate nature continues as a going concern. Many an animal devours another, but in the long run animals depend on plants. We see a new meaning in the saying, "all flesh is grass." Secondly, there is the fundamentally important fact that the oxygen of the air, necessary to keep the fire of life burning, is produced by green plants, which are able to split up carbon dioxide. In the original atmosphere of the earth there was little or no free oxygen. Thirdly, when we think of one of the greatest steps in evolution, the colonizing of the dry land by animals, we recognize that plants prepared the way. Not only did green plants supply food and oxygen, they afforded shelter, concealment, and abundant opportunities for animal adventures. That animals have paid their debts is plain when we think of the making of good soil by earthworms, or the pollination of flowers by their insect visitors. Importance of minute plants. In some way, still imperfectly understood, green plants are able to feed at a very low chemical level, on carbonic acid gas, water, and salts. The energy of the sunlight, shining through a screen of green pigment, chlorophyll, is utilized to dislocate the carbon dioxide molecule, and to begin the upbuilding of carbon compounds such as sugar. This is the most important process in the world, and is known as photosynthesis, the upbuilding of carbon compounds with the help of the energy of the sunlight. On this depends all the potential energy in the sacks of wheat, in the bales of cotton, in the fields of rice, and in the bodies of animals. The energy of the coal consists of the bottled sunshine of distant millennia. It is important to form a vivid picture of the circulation of matter in which green plants play so essential a part. The atoms of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen are continually changing partners in the never-ceasing dance, except when they sink into a resting group. The carbon dioxide formed in the vital combustion of the animal's body and liberated in the breath may be recaptured by the green leaf. The nitrogenous waste of myriads of birds form the nitrate beds of Chile, and the nitrogen atoms of these salts scattered on the wheat fields appear again in another grouping in the gluten of bread. The animal dies and sinks to the earth. Its body is buried by sexton beetles. The bacteria which cause all putrefaction break down the tissues into simple chemicals, which plants once more reincarnate in the cycle of life. In the article on bacteria, it will be shown that these microbes have their finger in many a pie. They are the smallest plants, but their role in the economy of nature is of incalculable importance. If green plants be called the producers, and animals the consumers, bacteria are the middlemen. But we must also recognize the significance of the microscopic green plants of the sea and the fresh waters. Diatoms enclosed in exquisitely sculpted shells of flint, see illustration, opposite page 318. And the hardly less beautiful desmids swarm in inconceivable numbers in the surface waters, along with other simple algae, and some microscopic green animals as well, and they constitute the fundamental food supply of higher forms of life. All of them are absorbing air, water, and salts. All of them are splitting up carbon dioxide, liberating oxygen, and building up carbon compounds. They make higher life possible. The microscopic specks are not less important than the great seaweeds. If all flesh is grass, then all fish is diatom and sea dust. In the springtime the surface waters of the lake are sometimes green and almost soup-like in the density of their alga population, and the silent crowded turbulence is spoken of as the breaking of the meres. A bucket of water lifted from the open sea may contain minute plants far more numerous than the stars we can count on a clear night. Variety of plant life. There is a long gamut from the diatoms, specks of living matter in beautiful shells of flint, to the daisy, from the hyssop on the wall to the cedar of Lebanon, from the annuals in our garden to the big trees of California which have sometimes lived for over 2,000 years. The first plants were probably free-swimming open-sea, single-celled algae, and there are many of them today. As shallow waters were established around up-bulging continental masses, fixed seaweeds began to flourish, fixed to the floor of the sea, and yet not out of the reach of the light. At a very low tide it is worth while wading out cautiously among the great seaweeds, some of them many yards long. This is the forest primeval, and it is possible, as Church maintains, that some of them were slowly transformed into terrestrial plants as the shore continued to rise. On a path of their own are the fungi, molds, and toadstools of many kinds, living on rottenness, or as parasites on green plants. Among them, but rather by themselves, most botanists include bacteria. Lichens are strange double plants, consisting of algae and fungi living together in intimate mutually beneficial partnership. On a higher level are the sprawling liverworts, and above them come the mosses, the ferns, the horsetails, and the club mosses. The beginning of seed plants may be traced very far back, probably to the Devonian period, but it was not till the geological Middle Ages that they began to come to their own. It was a great step in evolution when seeds were established, for that meant, as in mammals among animals, that what was liberated from the parent was a young plant which had lived for a considerable time in the seed box, as it were in partnership with its parent. Conifers and cycads represent a lower level than the ordinary flowering plants like the grasses and lilies, daffodils and orchids, buttercups and poppies, roses and lupins, bluebells and daisies. The variety suggested by these names seems endless, but the flowering plants fall into well-defined groups, and it is possible to work out a pedigree tracing them back to a few common ancestors. Just as all the important varieties of cultivated wheat can be traced back to the wild wheat, which still grows on Mount Hermon, so a genealogical tree can be constructed for the orders of flowering plants, and for the vegetable kingdom as a whole. Common characters of plants. Amid many idiosyncrasies, and in spite of some great exceptions, such as molds and mushrooms exhibit, there are some important common characteristics which bind plants together. There is the general possession of the leaf-green pigment called chlorophyll, conspicuous by its absence in the fungi and in the strange dodder, a flowering plant which victimizes others. Then there is the fact that the unit masses of living matter that build up the plant are boxed in by walls of cellulose, a carbohydrate with the same formula as starch, C6H10O5. This imprisoning of the living matter within very definite cell walls, which do not occur among animals, implies a great restriction in the motor activities of the plant, and determines in great measure the lines of their everyday activity. Another feature of plants is the absence of any method of getting rid of the nitrogenous waste products. All living involves the breaking down of proteins, with the consequent formation of nitrogenous waste. This waste is got rid of in higher animals by the kidneys and the skin, but in the plant, the deposition, instead of the elimination, of nitrogenous waste must tend to depress vital activity and deepen its slumbers, for a plant is rarely more than half awake. As has been already indicated, it is characteristic of plants to be able to feed at a low chemical level and to be able to effect photosynthesis. But this must be added, that typical plants, as compared with typical animals, are predominantly constructive, accumulating energy progressively, gathering stores in large quantity, often, it would seem, beyond what they can possibly need. Their particular regime or metabolism leads to a great hoarding of reserve products, to which vegetarian animals do justice in their explosive, adventurous life, and it must be remembered that as plants cannot move about, except in the case of some of the simplest, they depend for their racial survival on vegetative increase, on endowing their offspring with large legacies, and on being able to lie low within retrenchments abundantly provided with stores. The essential parts of a flowering plant. The poet Goethe was one of the first to see clearly that an ordinary flowering plant consists essentially of two parts, the axis and the appendages. The axis includes 1. The upward striving stem, which seeks the light and grows against gravity, and 2. The downward boring root, which avoids the light and grows towards the center of the earth. The appendages are the leaves which the stem spreads out to the light and in the air, and the flower consists typically of 4 tiers or whorls of transformed leaves, the sepals, petals, stamens, and carpels, the 2 last producing reproductive cells. It is interesting to examine in the spring the opening buds on the horse chestnut tree, for they show so clearly every grade between the scales that protect the bud and the ordinary leaves with their 5 leaflets. And a little later we may profitably examine the beautiful flower of the white water lily to see the transitions between the green sepals and the white petals, and the transitions between the petals and the pollen-producing stamens. When a wild flower like a briar rose goes double in a garden, this means that a large number of transformed leaf structures, which should have become stamens, have gone back into sterile petals. We see, then, that the general architecture of a plant is very simple compared with that of most animals. The laboratory of the green leaf. It is now necessary to consider in more detail how plants feed. Plants receive their raw material by means of their leaves and by their roots. The green leaves of plants receive carbonic acid gas from the air. The raw material they take in by means of their roots is no less indispensable, and this consists of water and mineral salts from the soil. Water enters the roots from the soil solution, drawn in through the thin walls and delicate root hairs which arise near the root tip and are continually renewed as the root grows. With this stream of water the plant receives its supply of mineral salts. From the air there passes into the leaves a slow current of carbonic acid gas. This is present in the atmosphere in the small proportion of 3 parts in 10,000, and the loss due to constant absorption by the plant is made good by the respiration of animals and the burning of fires. What the green plant does. The raw materials with which the plant works are thus water and mineral salts from the soil and carbon dioxide from the air. The green leaf is the laboratory in which the chemical syntheses take place. What goes on in this laboratory? Mainly, the manufacture of such chemical substances as starches, sugars, and oils, which are essential to living beings. The bulk of living substance is composed of 4 ubiquitous elements: carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, and oxygen, besides other elements such as phosphorus and sulfur. Nitrogen compounds are supplied in solution by the root of the plant. Carbonic acid gas is drawn from the air by the leaves. The plant breaks down the various compounds under the influence of sunlight, and builds up the chemical elements into fresh forms, whose great peculiarity is that they possess potential energy. All life depends on the peculiar green substance chlorophyll. It is only the plant that manufactures this essential chlorophyll. Animals take all their organic compounds ready-made from plants, and rebuild them into their own living matter, and use them as a source of chemical energy. The plant manufactures these organic compounds. The making of the leaf-green pigment called chlorophyll is in most plants carried through with the cooperation of sunlight. All plants, as we have said, absorb air, water, and salts. All of them split up carbon dioxide, carbonic acid gas, liberating the oxygen, which goes off free once more into the air, and building up the carbon compounds which make all higher life possible. Thus we see that we owe to the plant the oxygen of the air necessary for life. In an aquarium which has no artificial aeration, the animals will die if there are not enough green plants to keep up the supply of oxygen in the water, and the same is true over the earth as a whole. It is plants alone that can make organic matter, energy-yielding material, direct from dead or inorganic material. Every living animal in breathing gives out carbonic acid gas, and it is this gas which makes badly ventilated rooms stuffy when there are large fires and many people breathing. Yet it is food for the plant. The laboratory of the green leaf, then, manufactures an energy-yielding product. In the leaf cell the chlorophyll acts as an energy transformer and absorber. As energy cannot be created any more than it can be destroyed, What is the source of this energy which the plant makes available? If we burn a piece of cotton wool, which consists almost wholly of the carbohydrate called cellulose, its carbon combines with oxygen from the air, and the combustion results in carbon dioxide, water vapor, and a fluff of mineral ash. But besides these materials, there are also liberated two forms of energy, namely heat and light. This energy was locked up in the cellulose, and it follows that if the plant has built cellulose from the raw materials, carbon dioxide and water, it must have got possession of some energy corresponding to that which escapes as heat and light during burning. The source of this energy is sunlight. The capture of sunlight. A green leaf is a few cell layers thick, and is traversed by veins, the transport system by which water enters the leaf and elaborated food is carried away. Their branching network provides for the effective distribution of water to all the living cells. The lower skin of the leaf is pierced by minute openings, the stomata, so numerous that there may be 100,000 to the square inch. Through these minute openings water vapor flows out, and carbon dioxide flows in. They communicate with a system of air spaces in the leaf, which allows the supply of the gas to reach every cell. The leaf cell is the actual laboratory in which the upbuilding of food takes place. It includes, embedded in the living matter, numerous biscuit-shaped green bodies, chlorophyll corpuscles, whose function it is to absorb and transform the light energy. The flatness of the leaf means a large absorbing surface, and the arrangement of leaves is suited to avoid mutual shading, and consequent loss of life. The leaves of ivy on a wall look like a mosaic, and small leaves fitting into the space left by the larger ones. The branches of trees are scaffoldings which spread the foliage to the light, and all the devices of twining, climbing, and rambling plants serve the same end, namely the capture of parts of the sunlight. To the leaf cell, then, there flows water with salts through the veins, and carbon dioxide through the stomata and air spaces. In the cell there is an energy transformer and absorber, the chlorophyll. In the cell, too, there is protoplasm, the physical basis of life, which utilizes the raw materials and the energy of light, so as to transform the carbon dioxide and water into simple organic compounds of carbohydrate nature. In this process there is a liberation of oxygen, which passes out by the little openings. The formation of these simple carbohydrates is the fundamental process of plant nutrition, and indeed of life in general on our globe. For from them are derived all other organic compounds whatever, in animal as well as in plant. It will be noted that this process of photosynthesis is the exact reverse of the vital combustion which all living implies, where organic substance is combined with oxygen, breaks down into carbon dioxide and water, and gives up its store of energy. This continued production of carbon dioxide would, if there were no counter-process, lead to a cumulative vitiation of the atmosphere. It was the attempt to find the counter-process that led to the discovery of the plant's mode of nutrition. The discovery was made by the English chemist and philosopher, Joseph Priestley, one of the founders of modern chemistry. What food is used for? The sugars and the like that green plants make in their leaf laboratory may be used in the leaf itself, or at first transported to some other part. The plant moves but little, and then slowly. Its temperature is scarcely raised above that of the surrounding air, and so it requires only a fraction of the energy used up by the animal in moving and heat production. What energy it does expend is chiefly employed in carrying out chemical transformations and in the processes of growth. This energy is obtained, as in the animal, by oxidation or combustion processes, and an appreciable quantity of carbohydrate is used up in this way. Here we may note that in plants, the using up of oxygen and the giving off of carbon dioxide, which may be briefly called respiration, is demonstrable only in the dark. It undoubtedly goes on all the time, but as long as the plant is illuminated the respiratory process is completely masked by the much more active counter-process of photosynthesis, which we have discussed. Carbohydrates are also transported from the leaves to other parts of the plant, to be restored as reserves, often after conversion into other forms. The commonest food reserve is starch. This storage of food is a characteristic feature of plant life, and it is wrapped up with the habit of evading adverse conditions, such as cold in temperate climates, or drought in arid regions, by passing into an inactive resting state. The resting parts, such as bulbs or tubers or seeds, usually contain a good store of food, and at the expense of this the plant can make a flying start when conditions are once more favorable. On the thrift of the plant in this respect the human race depends. Finally, the carbohydrates, in the leaf or after transport elsewhere, are used to form other substances, such as cellulose, oil, chlorophyll, and living matter. In intricate ways the salts from the soil help in the transformations. End of section 5.
Of the Outline of Science, Volume 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Amy Graymore. The Outline of Science by J. Arthur Thomson. Chapter 3, Natural History 4, Botany, Part 2. Nutrition of the fungi. There are, however, some plants which possess no chlorophyll, and are in consequence unable to build up for themselves organic food from inorganic materials. Most familiar are the multitudinous fungi, which have probably been evolved from the various groups of algae, and include such diverse types as the skin of blue mold on jam, the fur of black mold on bread, the fawn-colored mushroom of the meadows, the bright-hued toadstools of the woods, the rust disease of wheat, the mildew of gooseberries, the blight of potatoes. All these, and innumerable others, are dependent on the organic food formed by some other plant. One group, called saprophytes, feeds on decaying organic matter; another group, called parasites, subsists on living hosts. The toadstool and the mushroom grow in the soil like any green plant, but in situations where the soil is rich in organic matter. The toadstool lives in the leaf mold of the wood, the mushroom in the well-dunged pasture. The food supplies of the fungus mold on bread or jam, or of the mildew on the gooseberry, are obviously generous. From such sources the fungus draws its nourishment ready made. Saprophytic fungi may play an important part in aiding bacteria to break down dead organic matter into organic compounds, which may be used once more by green plants. Some are of direct economic importance on account of the by products of their vital processes. Thus the yeast plant is a fungus which forms alcohol from sugar. But those fungi, the parasites, which feed on the living plant, are often very harmful, sapping the substance of their hosts and killing them by the poisons they manufacture. They are the chief causes of plant disease, and we get a glimpse of their fatality when we see a potato field reduced by blight, in a week or two, to a mass of rotting and offensive haulms. Lichens as double plants. The familiar lichens, which cover such unpromising places as stones and tree trunks, are double plants, composed of a fungus and an alga, growing together in a partnership so intimate that the result maintains a specific form. Without the aid of the microscope their dual nature would never have been discovered, and it was not held definitely proved until the two partners had been separated by a delicate technique, grown in isolation, and then made to reconstitute the lichen on being brought together once more. Flowering parasites and saprophytes. Among the flowering plants there are some very interesting saprophytes and parasites. Thus among British plants the bird's nest, the bird's nest orchis, and the coral root are saprophytes, the first belonging to the heath family, the other two being orchids. All three grow habitually in the leaf mold of woods, a soil rich in decaying organic matter. Though the details of the relationship are not fully known, it seems that a symbiotic fungus, which inhabits the roots of these plants, play some part in making the food in the soil available. In none of the three is there any chlorophyll. The bird's nest is cream coloured, the two other are dirty brown. Even the leaves are much reduced, being represented only by pointed scales. More familiar are parasites, such as the mistletoe, the dodder, and the broom rapes. The mistletoe is only partially dependent on its host, the apple or the fir, for it has green leaves and can manufacture carbohydrates for itself. The story of the whin. Green plants, too, may be constantly associated with partners belonging to lower groups. If we dig up a young whin or broom and examine the roots, we find that they bear a profusion of warts, ranging from the size of a pinhead on the smaller rootlets to lumps the size of a pea on the larger. These are abnormal swellings of the root tissue caused by the presence of a particular race of bacteria. The bacteria enter the root hairs from the soil, and multiplying, travel inwards till they reach the rind cells of the root. There they increase and pass from cell to cell as the root tissues enlarge in response to the irritation of the invaders. A mature wart or nodule cut across and examined with the microscope shows the cells packed with myriads of bacteria, and it has been proved that these are able to fix the nitrogen of the atmosphere, always present in solution in the water which enters the plant, and to convert it into organic compounds. Part of the supply is at the service of the host, and in return the bacteria are supplied with carbohydrate food. This extraordinary association is another example of symbiosis, a mutually beneficial internal partnership. These bacterial nodules are found on the roots of all members of the great family of the Leguminosae, the pod plants, to which belong broom, whin, lupin, pea, bean, vetch, rest harrow, and many others familiar as wild flowers or important as food plants. The members of the leguminous family number some 11,000, and are to be found over the whole globe, but their success may be appreciated by any one who has travelled only as far as the nearest common, or even a little way along the road leading to it. For the heath and the common are clad with whin, and the road is flanked with broom, shrubs the luxuriance of which, in stature, blossom, and seed, is at strange variance with the unpromising conditions of soil on which they flourish. It is the possession of a private store of nitrogen compounds, supplied by the bacteria, which makes this possible. Root fungi. The roots of many other plants, such as the beech, the pine, and the heaths, are associated with symbiotic fungi, mycorrhiza, and in some cases there is evidence that the fungus supplies its host with nitrogenous compounds. The best authenticated case is that of the heaths. These plants inhabit barren moorland stations. In such situations relatively few species of plants are able to flourish, and the vegetation is usually dominated by a few which are specially endowed, on the common by the whin, on the moor by the heather. The whin has its root bacteria. The heather has a fungus which spreads all through it and enables it to utilize the peaty soil. Thus the heather is in large measure an impostor. It thrives because it is interpenetrated by a partner fungus. Insectivorous plants. On wet moors there grow 3 genera of plants which show yet another method of supplementing the food supplies obtainable from the soil. These are the sundews, the butterworts, and the bladderworts, several species of each of which occur in Britain. These plants catch small flies and crustaceans, and absorb the products of their decay, or even actively digest them. They all possess chlorophyll, and it is in the supply of proteins and possibility of salts which the victims offer that we find the explanation of so curious a habit. The rosy leaf of the sundew is covered with little club-shaped tentacles, short-stalked at the centre, long-stalked round the margin. On the thickened end of each is a drop of sticky fluid, which, glistening in the sun, gives the plant its name, and which serves to catch incautious deluded insects. The entangled midge struggles, comes in contact with more tentacles, and is held more firmly. Stimulated by contact with the solid body, stimulated too by the chemical action of the insect, the marginal tentacles of the plant, even though they are not touched, soon begin to fold inwards. The stimulus spreads, and the struggling midge is pinned down in the centre of the leaf. Secretion of fluid increases, and in it the insect is first drowned and then digested. Some days after the fatality the tentacles bend back once more, uncovering a shriveled husk. The leaf is ready for fresh prey. The butterwort, like the sundew, traps its prey by a viscid secretion. It possesses no tentacles, but the margins of the boat-shaped leaves, covered with tiny glands which secrete the sticky matter, roll inwards. Digestion is slower than with the sundew, but ultimately the softer parts of the insect are absorbed and only the husk is left. The bladderwort adopts other means. It grows submerged in pools of peaty water, and, as is the case in many water plants, its leaves are divided into fine threads. Some of these are replaced by bladders about 1/10 of an inch long. The bladder opens in front by an arrangement like the door of an old-fashioned mousetrap. Small fresh-water crustaceans get entangled in a tuft of hairs projecting over the door and force their way in. The door of the trap falls to behind them and cannot be opened from the inside. They swim round and round till they die, and then, under the action of the bacteria of decay, their bodies rot and are absorbed. Pitcher plants. Curious as are the British carnivorous plants we have just described, they are excelled, alike in numbers and in refinement, by those of the tropics. Visitors to the glass houses of the Botanic Gardens at Kew or Edinburgh are familiar with the pitcher plants, Nepenthes and Sarracenia. Most of the Nepenthes are natives of the Malay region, where they ramble and climb through the bush. They have large leathery leaves prolonged into whip like tendrils. The end of the tendril, after it has grasped its support, develops into the pitcher, which in some species is as large as a quart pot, and in others as small as a thimble. Over the mouth arches a lid which prevents the entrance of rain, for the liquid within the pitcher is partly filled in a secretion of the glandular cells of the wall. The inner surface of the rim is set with nectar glands, and below these the wall is made very slippery by a coating of wax. So it comes about that an insect, attracted by the nectar, and straying on to this glycid, slips into the fluid and is drowned. During the subsequent slow digestion the body is not attacked by bacteria, for the fluid in the pitcher is antiseptic as well as digestive, and so keeps the food fresh. Venus flytrap. Most wonderful of all is the Venus flytrap, a relative of the sundew, growing like it on bog moss, but found only in the Carolinas. Its leaves are over an inch long, each with a winged stalk and a rounded blade. On the upper surface of each half of the blades are 3 prominent bristles, round the margin is a row of stiff processes. If an insect touches one of the bristles the 2 halves of the leaves clap together in something less than a second. The marginal processes interlock like the teeth of a rat trap, and the insect is captured. And then there are many suggestive details, such as Sir John Burdon Sanderson's discovery that the closing movement of the leaf is accompanied by an electrical change similar to that associated with the contraction of one of our muscles. Then follows a secretion so abundant that the fluid oozes out from the edges of the trap. Digestion and absorption follow in due course. After a while the leaf reverts to its normal state of expectancy. How plants and animals agree. If we trace an oak tree back to a sapling, and thence to a seedling, and thence to a seed and an ovule, we come at last to a fertilized egg cell, which is the beginning of the individual life. In this respect the oak tree agrees with the squirrel on its branches. Moreover, in both cases the fertilized egg cell divides and redivides, forming thousands of cells, a mode of development which allows of considerable division of labour. But we can go a step further and say that plants and animals agree not only in the individual beginning and in their cellular structure, but in the essential processes of life. Both show nutrition and the distribution of food through the body. Both show digestive ferments and breathing. It is true that photosynthesis is peculiar to green plants, and that there is little in the vegetable kingdom corresponding to the kidney function in animals, yet there is much in common among all forms of life. It may appear at first sight that this conclusion breaks down badly in regard to moving and feeling, which are the master activities in the animal, and are anything but conspicuous in most plants. Yet when we begin to think of leaves rising and falling, of flowers opening and closing, with the waxing and waning light of day, we see that there is much movement. And when we begin to think of the way stems bend to the light and roots make for moisture, or of the sundew answering back to the fly's touch, of the tendril responding to its contact with a slender twig, we see that there is much feeling in plants. In the Far East the sensitive plant often grows in great masses, and if a stone be sent crashing in among them, one can see the leaves sinking down into the collapsed rest position, and the stimulus spreading in a circle like a splash in a pond. The Venus flytrap may be cheated by a little piece of moist paper, and made to close on booty not worth having. But if it be cheated twice in rapid succession, it will not usually answer back to a third duping. This is surely the beginning of memory, an enregistering of experience, so that future activity is modified. We need not consider in detail the modes of movement among plants, but just as many a sedentary animal, like a coral or a sea squirt, shows something of the plant in its somnolent constitution, so we may say that the animal is lurking in many a plant. There is more than a trace of a dreamlike smile in many an orchid. It is always useful to recognize similarity in the midst of difference, but it is a mistake to exaggerate this so as to obscure significant divergence. It is of the very nature of plants to be sluggish. It is bound up with their independent mode of nutrition. They do not need to seek out their raw materials, they need only absorb the constantly renewed supplies of water and salts brought to the roots by the slow draining in the soil, and of carbon dioxide flowing over the leaves in the currents of the air. While the animal, essentially a hunter, has advanced to an ever increasing perfection of co ordinated movement, the plant has sunk into torpor. There are exceptions among the lower groups. Many primitive algae swim actively, the sponge and the sea anemone are sedentary. But the true contrast between the two kingdoms is seen in the squirrel romping through the boughs of the impassive beech. The distinction between active animal and sluggish plant is fundamental. The tactics of plants. Plants live their lives much as animals live theirs. Every plant is adapted to its particular station in life, and in its adaptations we see the outcome of the same struggle for existence and the same fundamental vital qualities — growing, multiplying, answering back, and so on — as we see in animals. There is the same competition, the same mutual aid when mutual aid pays. The plant, like the animal, shows the same self preservative instincts. The same factors of environment and heredity determine the individual life. There are new departures, new novelties among pansies, as we see among pigeons. Plants multiply. On the whole, they may be said to inherit the character of their parents. The same continuity of linkages as in animals binds one generation to another. In the plant world, as in the animal world, nature cares more for the race than for the individual. Thus we get in a general way the impression of plants as genuinely living creatures. Plants, like animals, employ their own peculiar tactics in adapting themselves to environment. We may suppose that an act of the plant is just as full of practical import as that of an animal. In the latter case the act may suggest intelligent behaviour; in the other it is only the result of an inherited tropism. The plant, like the animal, can camouflage and deceive. The pitcher plant and the bladderwort are as guilty of false pretences as the spider. The sundew and the flycatcher are adepts in preparing a bait for confiding insects. The white ant will squirt an obnoxious juice in the face of an attacker. So do plants produce poisonous and evil smelling substances to keep off an enemy. Each species lives for itself. No species ever undertakes anything for the sake of another, except in the expectation of a corresponding advantage. If the wild thyme lays by in its throat abundant honey for the bee, that is because the bee carries its pollen from blossom to blossom. The part the root plays. Typically the main root grows straight down, the main stem straight up. If a seed happens to be planted right way up, the young root and the stem grow on in the way they are pointing, but if the seed lies on its side or is inverted, the root and stem make up active curvatures till they point in the proper directions. When we sow seed we do not require to arrange it also. We leave proper orientation to the powers of the growing plant. Indeed, in many seeds the embryo is originally curved, and must in any case straighten out. Nor is this power confined to the seedling stage. A stem which has been bent over curves up, in the growing apical part, in the course of a day or so. The plant is capable of active curvature, and this movement is set agoing by some external directive influence. The movements of roots as they grow in the earth suggest that they are seeking for nutriment. Spots in the earth which are found to be unfavourable to progression are avoided with care. If the root sustains injury, a stimulus is immediately transmitted to the growing part, and the root bends away from the quarter where the wound was inflicted. When the exploring root tip comes near a spot where water occurs with food salts in solution, it at once turns in that direction, and when it reaches the place develops such absorptive cells as are adapted to the circumstances. We have seen what part the roots play in drawing nourishment from the soil for the plant. The part of the growing root most sensitive to stimuli is the tip, and the phenomena which are exhibited in consequence of its great sensitiveness are so astounding that Darwin compared the root tip to the brain of one of the lower animals. He wrote: "It is hardly an exaggeration to say that the tip of the radicle thus endowed, and having the power of directing the movements of the adjoining parts, acts like the brain of one of the lower animals, the brain being seated within the anterior end of the body, receiving impressions from the sense organs, and directing the several movements. But modern botanists describe the same facts in less picturesque language, in terms of ingrained tropisms. The roots penetrate and explore and feel their way underground, touching here, recoiling there, and insinuating themselves in such a way that they search every part of the soil. The length of roots is sometimes very great. The root system of a large cucumber plant was estimated by Mr. S. Clarke, in all its ramifications, at 25,000 yards, 14 miles, but this is open to doubt. Clover roots are said to go down to depths of 6 to 9 feet, but many weeds go deeper still. Coltsfoot, for instance, may be found living at a depth of 20 spades. In Egypt and other places the roots of acacias go down to 20 feet, or even farther, so that they can tap the water supplies, which are at a great depth. The root system of a tree only 1 year old may have a total length of 12 yards. Darwin showed that a root from which about 1/20th of an inch of the tip has been removed does not respond to gravity if laid on its side; it grows straight on. But if a root is first laid on its side for a few minutes and then decapitated, it does after a few hours curve downwards. He drew the conclusion that, while the reaction takes place in the zone of the most active growth, about 1/5 of an inch behind the tip, the effect of gravity is registered by the extreme tip only. Later ingenious experiments have confirmed this result. End of section 6. Seven of the Outline of Science, Volume 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Amy Graymore. The Outline of Science by J. Arthur Thomson. Chapter 3, Natural History 4, Botany, Part 3. Plant Tropisms. There is a close correspondence between plant responses and the tropisms exhibited by animals, and the plant's answer back to gravity is called geotropism. But while the moth which flies into the candle flame perceives the stimulus of light by special sense organs, the eyes, and moves by special motor organs, the contractile muscles, and has these linked by special conducting organs, the nerves, the root has at its disposal no such complex and highly specialized structures. Perception and conduction take place in the general living matter. Reaction is due to a slight change in the growth rates of upper and lower sides. Darwin's comparison of the root tip to a brain is really far-fetched. Ingenious attempts have been made to show that the plant has sensory organs of a primitive kind, for the perception of gravity, light, and touch. In a group of cells within the root tip there are numerous large starch grains, which lie heaped up on the bottom wall. If the root is laid on its side, the starch grains fall over and come to lie on the side wall, which is now lowermost. It is suggested that the root is in equilibrium only when these starch grains rest on the true bottom wall; that if they lie on a side wall the difference is perceived and the root curves till the tip points downwards. The grains resume their proper position, and equilibrium is restored. It is certain that some crustaceans maintain their balance by a similar apparatus of grains of sand resting in the cavity of the ear. In the case of the root the experimental investigation is beset with difficulties. But though the theory cannot be regarded as definitely established, it possesses considerable probability, and it may be that in these special cells we have the nearest approach that the plant shows to a sense organ. Why does the root curve down and the stem shoot up? To that question we can as yet give no answer. We can only say that it is their nature so to do. Many botanists expect, however, that as our knowledge of the varying structure and composition of living matter grows more precise, we shall be able to interpret the matter in terms of physics and chemistry. The theories which have been formed so far are unsubstantiated. The imagination of the scientist occasionally outruns his facts. Tendrils. The stem of the plant supports the leaves in the light, but in many plants a weak stem bears the weight of the leaves by twining round some stronger neighbor. The twining movement is of immense importance to plants like our honeysuckle, hop, and bindweed, which are thus much superior to the bramble rambling over a stone wall secured only by its spines, or the goosegrass rambling over the bramble secured only by its hooks. In the great forests of the tropics a great proportion of the vegetation consists of such types. The lianes, twining round trees, twining round each other, forming an impenetrable confusion of coiled and twisted cordage, reaching out to the light above the forest roof, supported on the dead pillars of the trees they have strangled. Robert Louis Stevenson gives a graphic picture of the form of the struggle for existence in his poem of The Woodman. The twining movement, like the movement of the root tip, is regulated by gravity. Tendril bearers respond to another influence, that of contact with a solid body. Like the tip of the hop, the whip-like tendril of the bryony sweeps round in a circle. This movement is not directed by external stimulus, but is purely automatic. But if the tendril touches a twig, a wire, a leaf, or another tendril, it is stimulated by the contact to more rapid growth on the side away from the exciting object, and so curves towards it. As it goes on curving, fresh portions come into contact and are stimulated, so that the whole tip becomes tightly wrapped round the support. Later the basal part twists into a corkscrew spring, once or twice reversed, and then becomes thick and woody. This spring breaks the force of the tug of a passing animal or of a great gust of wind, and saves the plant from being torn from its support. In his Climbing Plants, Darwin describes the conspicuous success of the bryony in riding the storm which battered many other plants. The tendrilled plant is more highly adapted for climbing than the twiner. The latter loses a third of its length in its coils, and while it can use only such supports as are nearly vertical, the tendril encircles anything that is solid and not too thick. The tendril represents some part of the plant turned to a new use. In the sweet pea it takes the place of the apical leaflets. In some vetchlings it represents the entire leaf. In some tropical orchids it is a root. In the bryony and in the vines it is a branch. If we gently stroke the underside of the bryony tendril, we can readily observe the answer back. After a few minutes the tendril curves towards the side touched. Only a solid body can induce the response. A stream of water, a violent rain shower, even rubbing with a stick of semi-solid gelatin, has no effect. Here is a fine example of delicate adjustment, for response to raindrops would be of no use to the plant, would even deprive it of opportunities of clasping proper supports. The tendril responds only to the touch that helps it. It is to the same stimulus that the sundew tentacles react when they fold on a struggling fly, though the movement is intensified by the insect's chemical action. Light and other influences. The seedling, fresh from the protection of the seed coats, young and delicate, is at once affected by all the influences of the world into which it has come. Gravity is not the only directive agency. The root grows against some shard, is slightly wounded, and turns away from the source of injury. It rubs gently against grains of soil, and the contact causes it to move gently to and fro. It feels its way through the crevices of the soil. It comes to a dry region and bends to the moister side. But the shoot, subject to all these stimuli in the soil, finds yet another director in light when it reaches the air. Everyone knows the window plant, with the shoots bent to the light, the leaves twisted round and spread flat to catch the rays. Light interferes with the action of gravity on the stem and is the primary cause of leaf movements. Its action is complicated by the fact that, unlike gravity, it is constantly changing its intensity and direction. Few plants can react so quickly as to follow the sun. Moreover, as growth ceases, the power of movement ceases, except in the case of those leaves which have jointed stalks. So it comes about that most leaves, as they mature, adopt a fixed position in relation to light. The sensitive plants. The sensitive plant is a vigorous shrub, usually reaching a height of some feet, in our hothouses. Each graceful leaf has a stalk jointed to the stem, from the tip of which spring 4 secondary stalks, each with a double row of leaflets. The foliage stands out from the stem, the leaflets are expanded. If the plant is gently shaken, instantly the leaf stalks droop, the secondary stalks fall together, the leaflets fold up. The whole scaffolding of green light screens has collapsed. In nature a wandering animal or a shower of rain brings about the same result, a series of movements so rapid that the reaction is complete in a few seconds. Soon a reverse sets in, and a quarter of an hour later the plant is in its normal condition again. A violent shock is not necessary. Touch the lower half of the joint of the leaf stalk and it droops. A little later the secondary stalks come together, then the leaflets fold up in succeeding pairs. Singe the apical leaflet and the chain of reactions is reversed. Make a cut in the stem and first the nearest leaf reacts, then the next, then one further away. The shock stimulus is passed on. It is conducted at the rate of an inch in the second. This is 1,000 times slower than the conduction along an animal's nerve, but 100 times as quick as the rate commonly developed in plants. The movement itself is slow compared with the wink of an eyelid, but very fast in comparison with that of an inverted root bending downwards. The movement is different from that of a curving root or stem. It depends on a sudden diminution of pressure in the cells of the lower half of the joint, which thus loses its rigidity and collapses. This allows of a very rapid fall. It also allows of the occurrence of the movement long after growth has ceased. Of what use to the plant is this spectacular reaction? It has been suggested that the rapid closing shakes off small insects feeding on the leaves. It has been suggested that the plant thus avoids damage by violent rain or hail. It has been suggested that browsing animals are frightened by the sudden change in the appearance of the pasture and repelled by the thorny appearance of the closed plant. It cannot be said that these explanations are convincing. They do not apply at all to a dozen other plants which show similar but less active leaf movements. The only animal that shows a distaste for the sensitive plant is the goat, which is not a native of the plant's original home in South America. We know, too, that the repeated movement is actually harmful. A plant which had been stimulated 12 times daily for 3 weeks attained to only 1/3 of the height of another left undisturbed. It was handicapped in assimilating power, but probably in addition the constant irritation upset its constitution in some profound way. Is it better to take the chance of being eaten or the certainty of being stunted? The reaction to shock brings with it clear advantages in other cases. The leaf of the Venus flytrap folds quickly together on the slightest touch of one of its sensitive hairs. In nature the touch is that of an injudicious insect which is subsequently crushed, drowned, and digested. The little filaments or stalks of the stamens of the cornflowers contract instantly by 30% when touched. The result is that the anthers, from which the pollen has been shed, are pulled down over the brush of the stigma, and the pollen is swept out and exposed to visiting insects which carry it to other flowers. The bilobed stigma of the musk closes on the pollen. In this case, and in others like it, the movement has an obvious biological advantage. Do plants sleep? As night falls, the trefoil leaves of the clover fold their leaflets up, the daisy flower closes, the tulip becomes once more a bud, the leaflets of the wood sorrel droop and close, the plants sleep. The term sleep, consecrated by long usage, is not a happy one, for with the sleep of animals this movement has nothing to do. It brings no recovery from a non-existent fatigue. It is in reality an active movement, not a collapse. Only in the seeming relaxation recurring as darkness comes on is there a superficial resemblance to the real relaxation of the animal and to the drooping of its drowsy lids. The tulip flower, like that of the crocus, closes as the air cools and reopens in the sun's warmth. By alternately raising and lowering the temperature, it may be made to open and close several times in one day. The daisy and the marigold open in the light and close in the dark. The night stalk opens in the dark and closes in the light. The marigold, too, may be made to open and close as many as 3 times in 24 hours. It may be made to open at night and close through the day by suitable changes in illumination. But its case is not so simple as that of the tulip, for when kept in continuous dark it opens and closes day and night. Even a flower which has opened for the first time in the dark, and has been kept thereafter in continuous dark, which has never experienced the daily change, carries out the periodic movement regularly. In the case of leaves the movement is induced by the change from light to dark. But in leaves, too, it may take place in continuous light or continuous dark. A scarlet runner may be raised from seed in darkness and an even temperature, and under these conditions the leaves rise and fall day and night. In such cases there is evidently a periodic movement independent of external changes in illumination and temperature, though these changes certainly strengthen and emphasize the normal daily swing. In some cases the periodic movement may be due to an after effect of the induced movement. But in the scarlet runner raised from seed, and the marigold brought to flower in continuous dark, this cannot be so. It is likely that the effective influence is some change in the electrical condition of the atmosphere. But the possibility of an inherited periodicity must be considered. The significance of these sleep movements is still a matter of discussion. Darwin tried to show that they benefited the plant by saving it from excessive radiation and cooling on clear, cold nights. Other investigators see a use in the avoidance of the deposit of dew. Flowers may save their pollen from being spoiled by rain by closing in dull weather. How plants protect themselves. Even this short survey shows that the power of limited movement in plants is widespread. The tropisms are specially important, for with their aid the plant arranges its organs so as to make the best of its environment. The ultimate position of leaf, stem, and root is the result of balanced reactions to all the influences that play on the plant throughout its growth. But the power of movement is nearly always restricted and gentle, confined to arranging the members of a stationary organism. Active locomotion belongs to the animal kingdom. Perhaps the nearest approach is in the telegraph plant, Desmodium gyrans, from the plains of the Ganges, in which there are continuous movements of the leaflets in little orbits, but no one knows why this plant should be so busy. We have said that plants live their lives very much as animals live theirs. Like animals, they have to protect themselves against natural enemies. Many animals live exclusively on a vegetable diet. As there are plants that strongly object to being eaten, they take effective measures to protect themselves. If they did not, the herbivorous animal itself would suffer, for its means of subsistence would in time disappear from the face of the earth. One means of defense employed by the plant is poisons and corrosive fluids, which it uses to good effect. But sometimes what is one animal's food is another's poison. For instance, the leaves of the deadly nightshade form the most important food of a small beetle, but the foliage is poison to the larger grazing animals. It is not clear to us how grazing animals discriminate between what is harmful to them and what is not harmful. Many plants have characteristic odors offensive to us. Others are odorless to the olfactory nerves of man, but they may make themselves known to the animal sense of smell. Wild animals probably recognize the dangerous plant by color, smell, or taste. The leaves of nettles, etc., have stinging hairs or bristles as protection against the attacks of large herbivorous animals. The stinging hair plays an important part, as it penetrates the skin and injects into the wound a poison which causes the painful burning sensation. In the cactus-like plants that variety of weapons is considerable. A single species often bears 3 or 4 kinds of weapons. They are armed with large spines and small bristles, short, thick, and thin, knotty and smooth, straight-pointed and barbed, and so by thorns, spines, and prickles plants often protect themselves. The nectar of some flowers intoxicates the bees, who are believed to acquire a taste for it. In his Botany of Today, Professor Scott Elliott describes a well-known orchid which has a hinged lip. When the unsuspecting insect enters the flower and passes over the lip, it is suddenly jerked forward and thrown into a sort of bath of liquid. As it painfully crawls out, with wetted wings, it has to carry away the pollen masses, and so effect pollination. There is no cruelty in this, for the insect is supposed to visit another flower, and cannot be much harmed. How plants are reproduced. In that great burst of activity in spring which heralds the approach of warmer weather, plants make an irresistible appeal to the eye. We welcome the clear colors of the snowdrop, celandine, and violet, and still more the bursting bud and shooting blade covering the earth with 100 delicate shades of green. The tree unfolds its leaves, and rootstock and bulb push up new shoots through the soil. Such plants wake from their annual rest and embark again on an active period. Among them arise myriads of seedlings, new plants growing from germinating seeds. In these we see a complete new start, the production of new individuals, the result of reproductive processes completed months before in the previous summer and autumn. The meaning of the flower. The seed, the kernel in the nut, the pip in the apple, comes from the fruit, and the fruit is the end of the flower. So it is the flower that is concerned with the reproduction of the higher plants. What is a flower? If we examine a buttercup or a lesser celandine, we find to the outside a number, 5 or more, of green scales, the sepals, together forming the calyx. which in the bud protect the delicate internal parts, and afterwards steady the full-blown flowers. Then comes the corolla of bright yellow petals. Inside the corolla are numerous stamens, each with a stalk or filament bearing a head, the anther, which contains the pollen. In the centre are many small green grains, the carpels, in each of which is an ovule or possible seed, containing an egg cell. The shape, color, number, and arrangement of these parts vary greatly from flower to flower, and on the floral characters the classification of flowering plants is largely based. In many flowers some of the parts are wanting, or are greatly altered in appearance. In the tulip the calyx, like the corolla, is bright colored, and the carpels, 3 in number, are united to form an ovary containing many ovules. This union of the carpels occurs too in the poppy, foxglove, and many others. In the grasses the calyx and corolla are absent, or represented by minute scales. The work of protection is taken over by small green leaves, which correspond to the 3 leaves which stand out below the flower of the anemone. In the hazel there are flowers with stamens only, gathered in golden drooping catkins, and flowers with an ovary only, grouped in buds, each crowned with a tuft of crimson filaments. In the willow the 2 kinds of flower grow on separate bushes. The secret of the seed. Before the ovule can develop into a seed, the egg cell it contains must be fertilized by the pollen. The pollen is received on the stigma, a most receptive surface, sometimes borne on a long style as in the sage, sometimes sessile on the ovary as in the tulip. The pollen grain germinates and sends a fine tube down through the tissue of the style and ovary to the ovule. The process of fertilization is preceded by a long process of intricate preparation. In the ovule there has been formed a single large cell, the embryo sac, containing a number of cells, of which 2 are important. Of these one is the egg cell or female reproductive body. The germinating pollen grain contains 3 nuclei, one of which is the male reproductive body or sperm. When the pollen tube reaches the ovule it brings its contents to the embryo sac, and the sperm and the egg cell fuse together. In each of these there is packed away the inheritance of one parent, the result of the fusion. The fertilized egg cell contains all the factors which, as development proceeds, will stamp the new organism with the features of its kind. The egg cell, stimulated by fertilization, commences to divide and grows into an embryo with a root, 2 leaves, and a shoot bud. These parts can be easily seen if we open up a soaked pea or bean. Development goes so far and then stops. The young tissues dry up as the seed ripens. It is cast loose in a state of rest. The higher plants, like the highest animals, liberate young ones. They are truly viviparous. End of section 7.
Of the Outline of Science, Volume 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kattekliek. The Outline of Science by J. Arthur Thomson. Chapter 8. Natural History 4. Botany. Part 4. Why flowers are bright. In the flower, then, we recognize the ovary as the organ which contains the female reproductive bodies, in which the seed is matured. The stamens produce the fertilizing pollen. The calyx is protective. But we have assigned no function to the corolla, that part which to our aesthetic sense is the essence of the flower, giving it distinctive form, giving it color, frequently giving it scent and sweetness. For the nectar glands are in some flowers associated with the petals, though in others with the stamens or ovary. The form of the flower, in particular the character of the corolla, is intimately bound up with the pollination, with the means by which the pollen is transferred from the stamens to the stigma. The flower is now understood as an arrangement by which pollination is secured. Though the 4 parts of the flower have different names and forms and uses, they have fundamentally a common nature, for they are all leaves, transformed in various ways and combining to fulfill the plant's chief end, that it should produce seeds which will develop into full-grown plants and bear next year's flowers. All the differences in the form and position of the floral parts which give individuality and character to different flowers, may be referred to the variety of means employed for securing the transference of pollen, which precedes fertilization. Perhaps nowhere else in nature can we see so clearly the fineness with which two organisms, flowers and their insect visitors, are fitted to each other. But while on the whole the variety of bright flowers corresponds to the variety of insects that visit them, or to the different ways in which one insect may work, it is not true that insects alone are important in carrying pollen. There are flowers in the tropics pollinated by hummingbirds; a few of our native flowers, for example those of the golden saxifrage, are pollinated by slugs. Aquatic plants, the grass-wrack of the sea as well as the pond-weeds and others of fresh water, have water-borne pollen. These are relatively small classes, but rivaling the insect-pollinated plants in numbers are all those plants with inconspicuous flowers, trees and grasses, which are pollinated by the wind. If the supply of food gives the insect a material inducement to frequent flowers, color and fragrance guide the visitor in choosing its particular source of supply. The golden standard of the broom, the glowing purple of the sage, heather, or thyme, the massed yellow flower heads of sunflower or marigold, the white expanses of hedge parsley and hawthorn, are illuminated signs advertising the goods within. That insects can distinguish between different colors is still a little doubtful, for it is not easy to discriminate between color as such and the intensity of light reflection. To our senses color is the most prominent feature of the flower, but to the insect scent may be more important. We know that insects can perceive odors to us quite imperceptible. It may be that they can discriminate between scents which to our coarser senses are the same. While color and scents are the guides, floral structure determines what insects can profitably visit a particular flower, and often decides the manner of the visit. Thus a flower like the hedge parsley has its nectar freely exposed, so that flies and such short-tongued insects can easily reach it. The nectar cup being shallow, all may drink, and flies wander about over the inflorescences, distributing pollen indiscriminately. But in a flower like the sage the nectar is concealed at the bottom of the deep corolla tube. It can be reached only by long-tongued bees, and the bee must enter the flower in one particular way. The lower lip forms a landing stage to which it clings. It thrusts head and thorax into the corolla throat, pushing against the lower ends of the two pivoted, lever-like stamens, the upper ends of which swing down and dust the bee's back with pollen at a definite point. On subsequently visiting a somewhat older sage flower, the bee first pushes against the forked stigma, which at this stage projects from the hooded upper lip, and so the pollen from one blossom is deposited on the stigma of another of the same kind. In such a flower as the sage, pollination can take place only in a perfectly definite fashion. Thus small flies cannot work the lever of the stamens. They are of no use to the plant, and in fact they are prevented from reaching the nectar by a circle of stiff hairs halfway down the corolla tube, a palisade which they cannot penetrate. Such refinements are especially characteristic of those highly specialized flowers which, like the sage, the orchids, the toad flags, and the broom, possess bilateral symmetry. This permits of the formation of a landing stage for heavy insects, and also leads to adaptations which keep the visitor to one path. These adaptations are well fitted to secure cross-pollination, which is advantageous as regards both quantity and quality of seed. Insect-pollinated flowers are not always bright. Thus the cuckoo pint attracts flies by a carrion stench, perhaps also by the lurid purple of the club of its flowering axis. The flies are trapped among the female flowers by a circle of hairs, modified stamens, inside the base of the hood. They are liberated by the withering of the hairs when the staminate flowers are ripe; dusted with pollen, they then escape to other plants. There are fruits, for example the banana, which ripen without pollination. There are even cases, like the brambles and the hawkweeds, where the sexual process has been so completely dispensed with that seeds are formed without fertilization. But usually pollination is a necessary preliminary to fruit and seed production alike. Sometimes, when a plant is grown in a foreign country, artificial pollination must be resorted to. The marrows and peaches in our gardens and hothouses are commonly pollinated by hand. The red clover never set seed in New Zealand till the humble-bee, to which it is adapted, was introduced. Wind pollination. In wind-pollinated plants the adaptations run on different lines. The pollen is dust-like and is produced in enormous quantities, for the chances of a grain born in the air reaching the stigma of a flower of its own species are remote. The grains are small and light. In the pine they are provided with two little bladders, the better to float in the air. Conspicuous corollas are useless. They would even be a hindrance, catching the flying pollen and preventing it reaching the stigma. The corolla has almost entirely disappeared. The windflower is small and inconspicuous. The stamens hang far out of the flower on slender filaments, dangling in the air, shaken by every gust. The stigmas too protrude, the crimson filaments of the hazel, the feathers of the plantain, the brushes which hang from the grass ear, winnowing the air for drifting pollen. Cross-pollination is secured by having male and female flowers on separate plants, as in the poplar, or by ripening the stamens and stigmas at different times, as in the grasses and plantains. Cross-pollination. Its meaning. Cross-pollination is of great importance to the progress of evolution. By it the various new characters which are always cropping up in different plants of a species are combined and recombined, so that an infinite number of races is produced for the sifting process of natural selection to work on. By cross-breeding, in nature as in the garden, the advance of evolution is speeded up. There are also cases where cross-pollination secures a stronger progeny. The maize is a notable example, and one thinks of Darwin's primroses. But it seems that this is due to a rearrangement of the hereditary complex, and not to any essential stimulation. There are certainly many plants which get on very well without cross-pollination, and there are many others which are adapted to secure self-pollination if the cross fails. The abundant, well-filled capsules which ripen among the leaves of the sweet violet in autumn are not the product of the spring flowers, so well adapted for insect visits, but somehow so seldom visited. They come from flowers hidden among the leaves, little green buds which never open, the stigmas of which receive pollen from the stamens of the same flower. Significance of the seed. The seed is generally considered the reproductive body of the flowering plant, but if we consider the process outlined above, we see that the true reproductive bodies are the egg cell and the sperm cell. When the egg cell is fertilized by the sperm cell, the initiation of a new individual is complete. All subsequent events are stages in the development of that individual. The seed is merely a phase at which development has been temporarily arrested. This arrest, the formation of a seed, has two functions. It provides for a dormant period, and it provides for distribution. Delicate leaves and shoots are not fitted to withstand extreme conditions, whether the rigors of the northern winter or the prolonged drought of more arid climates. The resistant leaves of the evergreens persist through the cold months, but broad-leaved trees shed their leaves and present bare branches to the storms. Herbaceous plants die down, persisting underground as rootstock, rhizome, and bulb, buried deep from the cold. But the seed is the most striking resting phase in the plant's life history. Dried up, its vital activities are reduced to a minimum. Its close-textured coats protect it. It can resist temperatures far below any occurring in the coldest winter. It can withstand considerable heat. Many seeds preserve their life for decades. The seed can carry the plant over the most unfavorable conditions of nature. For many plants it is the only resting and resistant stage. As important is the function of distributing the individuals of the race. Fixed in the soil as soon as it germinates, the plant can travel only at this specialized stage of its career, so the ripe seed is cast loose from its parent. Paragraph 10. The travel of plants. Plants travel in many ways. As the pod of the broom ripens, the drying tissues contract at different rates, and internal strains are set up. There comes a point, usually when the sun is hot, when the junction of the valves gives way, and with a little report they flick into spirals, jerking the seeds out to a distance of some feet. It is not far, but it is far enough to prevent that immediate overcrowding which would occur if all the harvest of the bush fell straight to earth. Then the seeds may be carried away by ants, for the sake of their little orange oil bodies. These travel further, and if they come to be buried, not too deep, in an ant hill, their chance of germinating in favorable conditions is rather increased. Many plants depend on animals for seed distribution. The burr of the goosegrass is a dry fruit covered with hooked spines, which catch in the coat of a passing sheep or rabbit. The waterfowl lifts a little dab of mud as it rises and flies to a fresh marsh. In the mud there may be a dozen seeds. But most conspicuously adapted for animal distribution are the fleshy fruits, attracting by their color and rewarding by their food value. The seeds of such fruits, apple, cherry, gooseberry, are protected by very resistant coats and pass undigested through the animal's food canal. The germinating seedlings benefit from the circumstances of its deposition. The thrush eats the berries of the mistletoe and wipes the seeds of its bill onto the bough on which it sits. The seeds adhere firmly to the branch as the glutinous juice dries, and in the following spring germinate in the position they require. Movements of wind and water carry seeds to great distances. Darwin showed that many seeds can float on salt water for weeks or even months and germinate at the end. By ocean currents the vegetation of strand and mangrove swamp has spread through great regions of the tropics. It is probable, too, that seeds of inland plants washed down rivers, stuck in crevices of sticks, have crossed the seas and colonized new countries. The wing of the maple fruit, of the pine seed, of the ash, allows the burden it supports to volplane through long distances, as gusts of wind lift and scatter. Still more effective are the tufts of hair which crown the fruits of dandelion and thistle with down, or the seeds of willow, cotton, and willow herb. A light fruit like that of the groundsel is sustained in the air by the gentlest of currents. It has even been suggested that the eddy caused by the sun's rays striking the white tuft and warming the atmosphere round it is sufficient to lift the seed in perfectly calm air. It is not surprising that plants which drift in currents of water and air should be widely distributed. The duckweed, floating in slow streams, carried on the feathers of aquatic birds, is cosmopolitan. The groundsels, an immense genus with over 2,000 species, took their origin in the Bolivian Andes. Evolving new species on their way, they traveled along the great mountain chains till they covered the earth. Besides such wanderings, the feats of a Marco Polo, even of a de Rougemont, pale. Vegetative multiplication. Gardeners often propagate plants by methods which dispense with seeds. They use slips and cuttings, they graft and bud. The success of the cutting depends on the ready formation of roots from near the cut surface. To go a little deeper, it depends on the loose integration of the plant's organs, on the power of independent existence possessed by separated parts. In the case of grafting there must be added the faculty of uniting with the tissues of the stock. This is not true reproduction. Here is no fresh start from a fertilized egg cell. We may call it vegetative multiplication. In nature similar processes are of frequent occurrence. The runners of bugle or silverweed take root and grow into new plants, separated in time from the parent by the death of the connecting pieces. Rhizomes of the bracken, anemone, or couchgrass branch and the branches become separate plants. Bulbs and tubers, as of the Scilla and lesser Celandine, bud off young plants. Water plants branch vigorously, and the branches, torn apart, start life on their own. The water thyme, introduced from America to 2 or 3 places in England in the 40s, is now spread over the whole country. At various places and times it has been a serious menace to navigation. This enormous multiplication has been entirely vegetative. The male and female flowers are formed on different plants, and only the female was brought to England. In its 80 years' colonization it has never set seed. Such plants seem to have entirely dispensed with the process of sexual reproduction. Whether they can go on indefinitely, or whether, for continued vigor, sexual union must take place now and again, we do not know. It is remarkable that so important a food plant as the banana has been multiplied vegetatively for hundreds or even thousands of years. Reproduction of lower plants. In the lower plants the reproductive processes are very different from those of the flowering plants. The cone bearers, yew, pine, fir, cedar, juniper, produce seeds which are not enclosed in a fruit. The ovules are exposed on the surface of the cone scales. Even the berry of the yew is merely a fleshy outgrowth, only partly covering the seed. A degree lower we come among existing plants to the ferns, and their allies the club mosses and horsetails, and these bear no seed. On the back of the frond of a fern are to be seen little clusters of spore cases, each of which contains numerous spores. A spore is a reproductive body consisting of a single cell. When it germinates it grows, not into a fern plant, but into a green blade of prothallus a quarter of an inch long. On the lower side of this prothallus are formed sexual reproductive organs, producing egg cells and sperms. The sperm is provided with cilia, and lashes itself to the films of surface moisture to the egg cell which it fertilizes. The fertilized egg cell develops into a new fern plant. A single cycle of the life history of the fern is divided into 2 phases, a sexual prothallus and an asexual spore-bearing fern plant. There are 2 alternating generations. The mosses, a side branch of the evolutionary tree, show the same features. The moss plant is the sexual generation. The capsule, parasitic on its parent, is the spore-bearer. The resting distributing body is, in both mosses and ferns, the spore. Paragraph 11. The main line of evolution was that which led through the fern-like plants to the flowering plants. There was evolved a vegetative equipment suitable to life in moist soil and dry air. Absorbing root hairs, roots, water-conducting tissues, light-absorbing leaves, borne aloft on a branching stem. The method of reproduction was gradually transformed till in the flowering plant the stage has been reached where the original equipment is barely recognizable. The plant is definitely emancipated from the medium in which it took its origin. Fertilization is now preceded by pollination, and in providing for that the plant has evolved, in relation to the insect, the flowers we know today. The fall of the leaf. Some plants are annuals and some perennials. Once annuals have flowered and the seed has been set, they wither and die. Perennials live on for several seasons. In these, and in shrubs and trees, reserve food stores of starch and oil are available in spring for forming the new foliage. Lilies and onions store reserve material, accumulated during the summer, in their bulbs. Other plants store material in underground tubers, which may be modified stems or roots. We may fitly close our study of the living plant by picturing the fall of the leaf, which so often marks the end of the year's activity. We have taken the following passage from Professor J. Arthur Thomson's Natural History Studies. The life of the plant is like a tide. It sets in with a flood in the spring, manifesting itself in growth of stem and exuberance of foliage. It rises to the high water mark and turns in summer when the blossoms burst and the flowers shine forth. It is well on the ebb by autumn, bearing on its breast all manner of ripe fruits and seeds, treasures to be cast on the shores of another spring. Each of these tidal periods, one may say, has its characteristic color. Green and gold are the colors of early spring. Orange, red, and purple mark the full splendor of summer flowers. The autumn, with its flame-like, often blood-like withering leaves, rivals all that has gone before. Is it not true to say that the ebb tide gleams with the glare of burning wrecks? Throughout the summer the leaf has lived an intense life, far more intense than we are inclined to give plants credit for, building up with the aid of the sunlight no small quantity of sugar and more complex carbon compounds, which are laid up in reserve by various parts of the plant. In autumn, however, the vitality is checked, the movements of the sap become very slight, and the leaves begin to die. It is partly that they are in some measure worn out by the summer's work, just as the bees are. It is partly that the outer world has changed. It is well that they should die, lest they begin to undo what they have so well done. But before they die they surrender to the plant that bears them all the residue of their industry that is worth having. There is a gentle current of sugar and other valuable materials from the dying leaf into the stem before the breath of approaching winter. Virtually dead, the leaves now are, empty houses, all dismantled, with little more than ashes on the hearth. But these ashes, how glorious! For in yellow and orange, in red and purple, in crimson and scarlet, the withering leaves shine forth. They are transfigured in the very article of death, in the low beams of the autumn sun. The yellowness is often due to the breaking up of the green coloring matter, called chlorophyll. The brighter tints are due to the presence of special pigments, which are by-products or waste products of the leaf's intense life. Finally, the leaves fall gently from the trees, or after writhing and rustling in the wind, as if loath to be separated, are violently wrenched off and whirled along the ground. But the tree is not really impoverished by the yearly loss of its leaves, while they, on the other hand, withered, faded, and torn, and molded by fungi, are buried by earthworms, to form, with the help of bacteria, the vegetable mold in which are cradled the seedlings of another year. Section 8